We're the underdogs.
We're going to be in 1 Samuel chapter 8, and we're continuing on in the series, Underdogs. We're kind of walking through 1 Samuel. I want to remind you that we're actually going to do the second part of 1 Samuel, Life of David, coming up this summer. And I know summer's a ways away, but I'm really excited about that. In June, there are a handful of us that are going to be traveling to Rwanda. This count today, we have 4 of us that are going, and we're going to the villages, remote villages in a region that I can't pronounce. I think it's Ngororero, something like that. This will be my 4th trip to Rwanda. I would ask that you be praying for all of us who are going. If you're not familiar with Rwanda, it's probably most known for the genocide that happened in 1994 when about 1 million people were killed. The killing was so brutal and the devastation so great that the survivors determined never to forget, and so they built these memorial centers, memorial genocide centers, so where people can go and for generations could go and remember. And the idea is that they would remember and determine in themselves as a people that this would never happen again. I remember going to a genocide center, and it was kind of like a bunker. It was mostly underground. There's a set of stairs that go down. You walk in a square, and then you come back up the other side of stairs. And the entire room is basically concrete shelves with human bones on them. And the site that we were at, 30,000 people had been murdered. And you have these shelves of, like a shelf of femurs and a shelf of rib bones and a shelf of human skulls, and it was really tough to go there. It was shocking, it was sad, it was devastating, kind of a reminder of people's capacity for evil. And the idea is never forget, and I got to tell you, after visiting that memorial, I never have forgotten. Last week in chapter 7, we saw in 1 Samuel, the Israelites were delivered from the Philistines again. And remember, they just had gone through a staggering loss of 30,000 plus men in their own world, their own time. And God intervened, and the Philistines were routed, and they decided to set up a memorial. Do you remember what it was called? Ebenezer. And Ebenezer was the stone, this statue, this monument to remind them that the Lord had delivered them. And it seems like for a time things went well. But if you've read the Old Testament much, you probably could guess that it didn't last very long. And that brings us to chapter 8, verse 1. As Samuel grew old, it says, he appointed his sons to be judges over Israel. One of the things that's interesting to remember when you read the history books of the Bible is that they're telling you the highlights of things that have happened. If you were to sit down and write your memoirs of your life, you wouldn't include the regular boring days. You'd skip that. You wouldn't take time to mention that you did laundry and dishes and swept the floor last Tuesday. You'd talk about the big things, when you got married or when you had kids or really significant events in your life. And that's how it goes with the history books of the Bible. They highlight the key events in the history of God's people. So when you may not realize that when you read chapter 7 and then you go to chapter 8, a bunch of years have transpired just between those 2 chapters in the book. And so many years have passed, and our key character, Samuel, has grown old. It happens. Verse 2 says, Joel and Abijah, his oldest sons, held court in Beersheba. They were judges. Their court was located in Beersheba, but they were not like their father, for they were greedy for money. They accepted bribes and perverted justice. It's kind of disappointing when you read that, because it seems like Samuel was having the same problem with his sons that his predecessor Eli had with his sons. Eli's sons, the Bible uses the word scoundrels to describe them. They abused their privileges. They dishonored God. They seduced women who volunteered at the temple. We've all read the headlines of prominent Christian leaders doing things like that. They say absolute power corrupts absolutely. There was no one there to call them out, to keep them in check, no accountability. And part of that might be geographic. You kind of wonder, like, why did Samuel let them get away with this? Well, it might have been geographic. Samuel's sons lived about 50 miles away, which doesn't seem seem like a big deal to us, but in their day, there's no phones, there's no cars, there's no bus. There was no easy way to go down and visit and check in and monitor how things were going. We can speculate that he didn't know exactly what was happening or the extent of what was happening, but whatever the case, things had slipped away from Samuel. And so many times when we read passages like this, we kind of miss the little details. There's this one thing that the text doesn't mention, but it's important. Judges were appointed by God, not by men. And yet the text says that Samuel had appointed his sons as judges. Sons of kings inherit thrones, but not judges. Samuel had overstepped his authority and had done something without consulting God. And yet again in the book of Samuel, we see that when you bypass God, things backfire. Have you ever done something without consulting God and had it backfire? I mean, I have. Those boys weren't like their father. Samuel was a godly man, his boys weren't, and people took notice. Verse 4 says, finally all the elders. That finally means like they reached a point. Something needed to be said. Finally, all the elders of Israel met at Ramah to discuss the matter with Samuel. Look, they told him, you are now old and your sons are not like you. Give us a king to judge us like all the other nations have. Something big just happened. I'm not sure if you caught it. I want to hit pause for a second and kind of do some teaching on the history of God and his people. Israel's history parallels world history. Sometimes we're reading the Bible and we don't realize that at the same time something we're reading about in the scriptures happening, like the Great Wall of China was being built, right? So God's people, we're seeing like the history of one nation that's among many other nations that parallels world history. So if you just quickly run back through, Adam was the first man, Eve was the first woman, created in God's image, and they were early primitive people. In the days of Abraham, God's people were small in number, and they were nomadic and tent-dwelling people. That was how people lived back then in the world, not just Abraham. Even the place of worship, as we get further into like with the law of Moses, and when Moses appeared, the place of worship wasn't a building, it was a tent. Moses led them out of Egypt, established the law. Worship of God was actually first organized under Moses. That was a major development in the history of God's people. They were still semi-nomadic all the way through the time of Joshua, and by the time you get to David and Solomon, Israel is becoming kind of a leader on the world stage. It's becoming more organized, more civilized. They're establishing government and commerce and infrastructure, and they finally constructed the temple of the Lord in the days of Solomon. So the stuff that we're reading about today, just to give you kind of a frame of reference for you history buffs, the stuff we're reading about today is happening in the earliest part of the Iron Age, and technologically speaking, Israel was actually behind some of the other nations, which is the Philistines primarily, and that's why the Philistines had crushed Israel, because they had iron melting technology, and Israel was still stuck using bronze and things like copper. So the nation of Israel is developing kind of alongside the development of the people on the planet. And as the nations of Israel were changing around them, you'll notice what God's people said, give us a king to judge us like the other nations have. See, other nations had begun to move toward a new system of governance, and they're like, hey, why can't we have what those guys have? And can I just say, this has always been the biggest problem for God's people for all of time. It was Israel's problem then, it's our problem today. While we want to follow God, and I think we all want to follow God, we also want to be like the nations. Maybe you put it a little differently. We want to be like everybody else. We want to belong to God and fit right in our world. There was a time when it felt like people could be American and Christian, and there wasn't much friction between those things, but following Jesus and following American culture have become divergent paths. They're paths they're heading in opposite directions, and I think this is really where the church is failing. Most churches I know teach the Bible. Most churches I know are doing missions and outreach. Most churches have kids ministry and youth ministry. They pray, they take communion, they sing songs, they share the gospel, but what we aren't doing well is helping people find their identity in Jesus and their community with other disciples. And so when our kids go to college and drop out from the faith, it's not from a lack of Bible knowledge. It wasn't from a lack of information. I think we always act like, when we talk about these scenarios, that there's a sinister atheist professor who just tricked them into leaving their faith. The reality is, our kids leave home and leave their faith because they don't know who they are outside of their homes. The only Christians they know and have relationships with are their mom and dad, and they aren't around at college. They aren't anchored in any personal way to Jesus Christ, and the people they relate to aren't God's people. They relate to the people in the world. So they're trying to believe in Jesus and be like everybody else. But being like everybody else categorically means you're not following Jesus. We want to be like the other nations. We want to be like everybody else. Give us a king. And can I just say, this 3,000-year-old story is playing out in front of us today. All around us are people in churches saying, we want to be like the nations. And it's not limited to the young people. We want to be rich and Christian. We want to be woke and Christian. We want to be queer and Christian. We want to be patriotic and Christian. I want to be a socialist, a communist, an environmentalist, and a Christian. Maybe try Oregon. Why can't we be, I'm an Oregonian, I can say that. Why can't we be like everybody else and be a Christian? That's what people are really asking. That's the bottom line. And I want to say it's a fair question. It really is a fair question. Why can't I believe what we believe and be friends with all these people and do what they do? Why can't we believe like everybody else and be a Christian? Why can't I go along with popular culture and follow Jesus? Because they're leading in opposite directions. And if you don't believe me, take it from the mouth of Jesus. In Matthew 17, he said, you can enter God's kingdom only through the narrow gate. The highway to hell is broad and its gate is wide for the many who choose that way. You can't go with Jesus and go with the world. That's the tension we all feel every day. Can I watch what the world watches and be a follower of Jesus? Can I click where the world clicks and still follow Jesus? Can I act and think and behave and desire all the things that the people around me have and want and desire and be a follower of Jesus? And I want to say that's the battlefield right there. That's where the battle's happening. That's where the tension lies. That's what Israel wanted to do. Up till then, they had tribal leaders and prophets and judges. But in 1 Samuel 8, it marks a significant change in Israel's history. This is the first time they'd ever asked for a king. Great idea, right? We're like in a post-monarchy society. We would never want a king. And they're like, we got this idea. It'd be great to have a king. And Samuel, it says, was displeased with their request and went to the Lord for guidance. I like that line. He was displeased. Probably a massive understatement. First of all, they approached him by saying, you're old. And I can't help but share this. In the King James Bible, it literally says, behold, thou art old. Maybe if there's someone older sitting next to you, you could turn to them right now. No, I wouldn't do that. Behold, thou art old. Teenagers, maybe don't use that on your parents. Behold, thou art old. That was the first thing they said to him. And the second thing was, and your sons are no good. We want a king. Now, I want you to notice how he handled the adversity and the setback. Instead of leaping into action and making a hasty decision, he did something that we've not seen so far in the book of 1 Samuel. He prayed first. Instead of reacting hastily, he said, you know what? I'm going to go seek some counsel from the Lord. And this is what God says. Are you ready for this? Do everything they say to you, the Lord replied, for they are rejecting me, not you. They don't want me to be their king any longer. Can I just say, I think those are some of the saddest words in the scripture. God's chosen people said, we don't want God as our king anymore. And that's how God characterized it. That's what he said they were doing. Israel had rejected God as their king. Everybody else had a human king, and they're like, we want one of those. The thing that singled Israel out was that they were God's people, and they were led by the Lord himself. That was the biggest distinction of Israel and all the other countries, but that wasn't good enough for them. They didn't want to be ruled by God. They wanted to be like everybody else. They wanted to be led by a king instead of the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and this is their pattern. Listen to what God says next. Ever since I brought them from Egypt, they have continually abandoned me and followed other gods. And now they're giving you the same treatment. Do as they ask, but solemnly warn them about the way a king will reign over them. They were about to go from theocracy to monarchy, and God said, I'll allow it, but give them a warning. Having a king's going to cost them. Here's what's crazy. God had predicted this hundreds of years prior. If you read the Old Testament, you go back to Deuteronomy 17, this is hundreds of years prior to this event. It says, you are about to enter the land the Lord your God is giving you. When you take it over and settle there, you may think we should select a king to rule over us like the other nations around us. If this happens, be sure to select a king, select as king the man the Lord your God chooses. He's like, this is what's going to happen when you get there. I know it, I'm calling it, and then it happened. It's almost like God saw it coming or something. It's so weird. God said to Samuel, hey Samuel, don't take it personal. They're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. Go ahead and give them a king, but warn them. Go over the fine print with them before you pull the trigger on this. I wonder if anybody here remembers 2008. It wasn't that long ago. I think Cody was even born in 2008. They call it the Great Recession. And you know why I remember it is that my dad and his friends freaked out in 2008. You know why? They were all coming up on retirement age, and they all had these fat 401ks, and then the economy tanked. We lived in a neighborhood that was a bunch of new starter homes, a lot of young families, and many of those families bought their home on an infamous ARM loan. ARM stands for Adjustable Rate Mortgage. Never get an ARM loan. When those families signed up to buy their homes, they're given a choice between an ARM loan, adjustable rate, or a fixed rate. And at the time, those ARM loans were very low interest. And so a lot of people, when they looked at the savings of the then low rate at the ARM, they chose the ARM. And everything was great. They bought houses, people were getting into homes, and they were doing fine until the adjustable rate mortgage adjusted a lot. And suddenly all the payments that were easy to afford shot through the roof, and at the same time the property value went down, so their payment's big, their house is not worth much, they couldn't afford the payment, they couldn't sell it because they owed more than it was worth, and many people just walked away. Do you remember 2008? Our neighborhood was empty. We had so many houses on our street that no one lived in. People literally just gave it back to the bank and walked away. Always read the fine print. Here's the fine print that Samuel goes over with Israel, and it's pretty fine. He says, so Samuel passed on the Lord's warning to the people who were asking him for a king. This is how a king will rule over you, Samuel said. The king will draft your sons and assign them to his chariots and his charioteers, making them run before his chariots. So let me get this straight. You're going to take our sons away and make them fight in wars? They'll be conscripted and they could possibly die. Line 1, he'll take our sons. Check. You know, my sons are kind of actually annoying. What's the second part? Some will be generals and captains in his army. Some will be forced to plow his fields and harvest his crops, and some will make his weapons and chariot equipment. The king will take your daughters from you and force them to cook and bake and make perfumes for him. What kind of king wears perfume? Just saying. So our sons are going to be taken away and conscripted to labor for the king. They'll fight his wars, they'll farm his land. And wait, you're taking our daughters too? I kind of like my daughter. But some of them will become bakers and perfume makers. That's kind of like trade school. Not so bad. What's line 3 say? He'll take away the best of your fields and vineyards and olive groves and give them to his own officials. Wait a minute. He's going to take away our best land and give it to people that are his friends? That seems a little unreasonable. What's line 4 say? He'll take 1/10 of your grain and your grape harvest and distribute it among his officers and attendants. So let me get this straight. He's going to take our sons, our daughters, our land, our crops. He'll take stuff we work for and give it away to people that work for him. that seems like a bit of an overstep. What's line 5 say? He'll take your male and female slaves and demand the finest of your cattle and donkeys for his own use. He'll demand 1/10 of your flocks, and you will be his slaves. He'll take away our slaves and make us slaves? He'll demand that we give him our livestock? He'll demand it without even saying please? It gets worse as it goes. This seems like kind of a lot. What's in it for us again? Verse 18. When that day comes, you will beg for relief from this king you are demanding, and the Lord will not help you. Samuel read him all the fine print. He spared no detail. He's not leaving any doubt about what's going to happen when Israel rejects God and gets a king. You'll be so worn out, he says, from all these things that you'll beg for relief and it won't come. And they're like, you can imagine these people going, that's a tough decision. Have you ever warned someone about doing something foolish? I mean, have you? Have you ever really sat someone down and tried to warn them about the thing they're about to do? It doesn't always go well. I mean, please, this relationship you're in is hurting you. Please, your drinking is out of control. Please, you're teetering on financial ruin. Please, the anger in your life is going to catch up to you. Please, this job is taking you away from your wife. Please, don't abandon your family for this other woman. Please don't walk away from the Lord your God. Please don't throw away your faith. And sometimes when you have those conversations, sometimes it works. And oftentimes people go right ahead and do the stupid thing that ruins their lives. That was Israel. I used to have an opportunity to preach at a federal prison. My friend was a chaplain there, and I'd get to go in and preach at the medium security facility. And I remember talking to this guy, and I was thinking, man, this guy seems not like a criminal. I don't know what, criminals look like or seem like, but he just seemed like he didn't belong in prison. And so I asked him, I go, man, what's your story? And he told me, he said, I owned a construction company. I was very successful. I had a nice home and nice cars, and business is booming. He said, I have a beautiful wife and a few small kids at home, and his life was really, really good. He was happy. Someone he knew asked him if he wouldn't mind. He had a company that would travel into different states, if he wouldn't mind transporting a duffel bag of cocaine and just drop it off at this location in this other state he was already going to, kind of use the business as a cover. He said, the thing is, I didn't need the money. I didn't need it. I had plenty of money. But he was in this place in his life where he was proud. He felt like invincible. He felt like he was the man. He could do what he wanted and when he wanted, with whom he wanted, and no one told him no. And so he took the drugs and he took the money, and every time he made a run, he'd tell himself this would be the last time. And everything was good until it wasn't. And it wasn't good, it got really bad. He was arrested, and he lost his business, and he lost his wife, and he lost his freedom. And only behind bars in a federal prison did that man humble himself and admit his need for Jesus. That's an extreme example. Most of us can't relate to that. Most of us have never been offered a big bunch of cash for transporting drugs across state lines. So let me bring it down kind of to our world. Talk about some more common things. Only after a series of failed relationships, only after years in a miserable marriage, only after years of walking in rebellion will some people finally repent. Only after years of addiction, only after years of fighting God and fighting people, only after years of being stubborn and angry and defiant and selfish and greedy and divisive and hateful and annoying, after years of being unhappy and unproductive and a complete waste of oxygen, will some people finally give it up for Jesus. And some never do. Have you ever warned someone, from your heart, sat down and pleaded with someone not to sin any longer, not to walk away from God anymore, beg someone not to do what they wanted to do? Has someone ever warned you? That's what Samuel was trying to do for the people of Israel that day. There's a famous quote from Charles Spurgeon, an old theologian from the UK. He said, "If sinners be damned, at least let them leap to hell over our dead bodies. And if they perish, let them perish with our arms wrapped around their knees, imploring them to stay. And if hell must be filled, let it be filled in the teeth of our exertions, and let no one go unwarned and unprayed for." Isn't that great? He's like, we should be the people getting in people's ways as they try to sin. We should be the people with our arms around people's knees, begging them not to do the thing that's going to destroy their life. Israel was headed the wrong way, and Samuel wouldn't let them do it without saying something. Church, we have to say something when we see people walking away from God. We have to stop being politically correct and stop being cowards and stop being afraid of people not liking us. Jesus called us to love people in a selfless and truthful way. And how can we claim that we love people if we don't say something when we see them walking away from God? Amen. Verse 19 says, the people refused to listen to Samuel's warning. The humanity of these things is just so real to me, because I've literally had this happen. I've been the guy pleading with someone not to do what they intend to do and have them say, yeah, I'm going to do it anyways. It's heartbreaking. It's soul-crushing. It's the worst thing ever to watch people head into a way that you know is going to ruin them. And sometimes these people are our kids. They're our friends. They're our parents. They're neighbors and coworkers, and they're intent on doing the wrong thing. And they said to Samuel, even so, after all the fine print, and it sounded horrible, didn't it? Even so, we still want a king. Verse 20, we want to be like the nations around us. Our king will judge us and lead us into battle. They read all the fine print and then said, where do we sign? It's so funny when you kind of think about this, because they're like, we don't like your sons, but we're happy to have a king and his sons. I mean, that's what's going to happen. A king's going to come up and then have sons who will be your rulers. They felt cheated by Samuel's sons, but they're going to get cleaned out by a king and his sons. They wanted a king to lead him into battle. Didn't God just defeat the Philistines in an epic battle without a king? They were warned, they were reasoned with, and they still wanted what they wanted. They didn't care what it cost them. They were going to do it anyways. There's an old saying that says, sin will take you farther than you want to go, keep you longer than you want to stay, and cost you more than you ever wanted to pay. Just like the people we warned, just like the people who warned us, Israel said, we want what we want, and we don't care what you say. If you ever read the whole books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, you'll know that this didn't end especially well. They went from Saul to David to Solomon, and every single thing God predicted in Deuteronomy came true. Everything that Samuel predicted came to pass. And by the time the 4th king of Israel, Rehoboam, became king, he was such a bumbling idiot. He split the nation into 2 countries. And then they fought each other, and they fought everybody around them, and they had an unprecedented run of bad kings. And then they were completely conquered repeatedly. They were conquered by Assyria. They were conquered by Babylon. They were conquered by Persia. They were conquered by Rome. Israel went through this long period of corruption and suffering, and you may not realize it, but these failures were leading up to something redemptive. Verse 21 says, Samuel repeated to the Lord what the people had said. It's kind of funny, like, God's like, yeah, I already knew. Samuel's so ticked off that he goes back to the Lord and says, do you know what those people said? God's like, yeah, actually I do. And the Lord replied, do as they say and give them a king. Then Samuel agreed and sent the people home. Now, let me just quickly kind of hit pause and say something. The question is, why would God give these people what they wanted when he knows it's going to lead to their own harm? There's this fascinating passage in Romans 1. I don't have time to read it all today and explain it, but in Romans 1, it talks about God, and some of the versions say handing people over, or other versions say giving people over to the desires of their hearts. So there's this thing where God does with us where he's like, you really don't want to go there, Eric. Don't do that. the Holy Spirit's tugging on us. The Word's convicting us. He might even send people to tell us, and don't go there, don't go there, don't go there. There's a point when our hearts are so hard against God and His ways that God finally goes, all right, I'm just going to move. and you go on and do this thing that you have in your heart to do and see what happens. Sometimes God gives us the things that we think we really want to show us how foolish those things really are. And I bet if we took time to give testimony this morning, we could all tell about times when we went away we probably knew we shouldn't have, and what happened, and how God used it in a redemptive way to bring us back. He let us go the place we wanted to and suffer the way we needed to learn the lesson that God actually does know best, and things go better when we go with God. So there's this theme that runs through all these periods. Over and over again, God appointed men to lead people. And they were saviors of a kind. It's really interesting to think about. They were kind of like figuring something that was coming. So like Adam was like the first man, and he ruled over Eden with his wife, and yet he was deceived. He was a Christ-like figure, but he was deceived because he was human. He was deeply flawed. And then Abraham, this great man of God, but was often faithless. And his mistress bore sons that eventually became the enemies of God's people. And then you get to Moses, who was doing really well until he got kind of cocky. And then God said, you're not actually going to make it into the promised land. And David, who started out strong and ended kind of horribly as an adulterer and a murderer. And Solomon started out strong, the wisest man of all time, and then he became an idol worshiper with 1,000 wives. And Rehoboam, he just kind of started weak and ended weak. Pretty much the downfall of from there. All went downhill from there. So you trace these kind of the pattern of these would-be saviors for God's people who always seem to rise up and then kind of fall short. It's almost like God saying, you can't put your trust in a person. Not fully, not like you can Him. And this pattern plays out over and over again for God's people for a couple thousand years until one day a new king came around, and His name was Jesus. And he preached a message that was so different than all of His predecessors. He announced the arrival of a kingdom, one that would exist inside of all the kingdoms of the world. Instead of setting up a kingdom, which is what everyone expected Him to do, He's like, I'm starting a kingdom. I'm announcing the arrival of a kingdom that's going to exist in all the places on the planet. And I'm going to be a different kind of a king. And we're going to be a people, not a place. And instead of defending a territory, we're going to promote a cause. And it distinctly devoid of kings and presidents and politics and power structures. And it's a kingdom characterized by love. And that's our kingdom. And that's our king, King Jesus. There's this old saying that says, be careful what you wish for. We want to be like the nations. I want to be like celebrities. I want to be rich and famous and free and have fun and be cool. And I want pleasure to be my God, and I want comfort to be my aim, and I want fun to be my priority. And if I can just sprinkle a little Jesus on that, that'd be great. I just want to tell you this morning, that's not how it works. So many people are living the American dream, and they try to dabble in Jesus so they can feel spiritual. They just want enough Jesus in their life that they can feel good about themselves. And some people come into places like this and they live like hell all week, and then come into a place like this and they get a little taste of heaven, and it eases their conscience. They want to know that they're good with God, but they don't want it to cost them anything. They want to feel like they're glory bound, but they don't want it to inconvenience them in any practical way. They don't want Jesus to cramp their style or kill the buzz. Why can't we have it both ways? Why can't I be a follower of Jesus and be like everyone else in the world? And Jesus said, look, if you try to hang on to your life, you'll lose it. Isn't that weird? That's the upside down nature of God's kingdom. If you try to save your life, you're going to lose it. But if you give up your life for my sake, you'll save it. Isn't that crazy? He's like, all the things that you're trying to hold on to and be part of, and the things that feel so important, to go with me, you've got to let go of that. And by the way, if you keep all that stuff, it's going to kill you. But if you can loosen your grip and walk away and attach your heart from that and follow me, you'll have everything you've ever wanted and more. You'll have life in this life and life beyond this life.